Gender differences in accessing and using climate-smart agricultural technologies in Tanzania. Authors: Nchanji Aileen, Lutomia Cosmas, Mutua Mercy, Wazwa Boaz, Ndunguru Agnes, Kabungo Catherine, Katunzi Adolf, Nyamolo Victor. Background: agriculture is critical to the economic growth of sub-Saharan African countries, but is negatively affected by climate change. Some of the rampant effects of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa include prolonged drought, flooding, erratic rainfall, increased pests and diseases, and rising temperatures. Smallholder farmers are the most affected because of their reliance on rain-fed agriculture. As a result, climate change results in increased cases of food insecurity and poverty, affecting local markets and slowing down economic growth. The vulnerability of smallholder farmers to climate change is worsened by pre-existing conditions, including low access to markets, weak institutional support and policy, low technology adoption, and poverty. The impacts of climatic shocks are skewed, with women being the most vulnerable group in Tanzania. Smallholder farmers, especially women, cultivate relatively small pieces of land which often lack access to reliable irrigation. Their participation in output markets is low, largely because of poor harvests. As a result, climate change has undermined the ability of Tanzania to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Few studies have focused on how access and use of these technologies vary by gender in Tanzania. The potential role of individuals and households in gender differences in the use of climate-smart agriculture has not been explored comprehensively in Mbeya and Mbozi districts. This study investigated the role of gender in the uptake of climate-smart agricultural practices in Tanzania. Conceptual framework: financial capital, credit, cashable properties, and regular cash flows. Physical capital, farm machinery and equipment such as computers and mobile phones. Human capital, knowledge and skills acquired experientially or through education. Natural capital, land. Demographic characteristics, age, household headship, gender, primary occupation, marital status, household type. All this contributes to increased access and use of climate-smart technologies. Methodology: study area. The study was conducted in Mbeya Rural and Mbozi districts. Main occupation: farming. Seasons: long rains October to May, short rains June to September. Sampling design: 2 districts were selected for the study, Mbeya and Mbozi. 6 villages were randomly selected from the 2 districts. Participants were then selected randomly from lists of farmers that were provided by local extension officers in the different wards. Farmers were randomly selected using the RAND function, resulting in 357 respondents, 132 youth, 110 women, and 115 men. The 2 districts were selected for the study because they are among the main bean production hubs in the southern highlands of Tanzania. They also receive diverse bean value chain interventions. Data collection. Data was collected using a semi-structured questionnaire. The tool was co-developed by all stakeholders. The information collected comprised demographic characteristics, land ownership, access and allocation to bean production, types of seed and bean varieties planted by farmers, bean production practices, production constraints, farmers' access to information on bean production, technologies and marketing. Data analysis. Measures of central tendency, mean and standard deviation. Analysis of proportions, frequencies and percentages. Inferential statistics. Analysis of test of significance, ANOVA and chi-square. Results: socio-demographic characteristics of respondents by gender. Most households were men-headed, Women had lower education qualification compared to men and the youth. 31% of the women were either widowed, separated or divorced. Farm and bean farming characteristics. Decision-making on the purpose of growing beans was made jointly between men and women in a household, but secondly by women, even though men said otherwise. Farm and bean farming characteristics. Men owned more land, 5 acres, than women, 3 acres, and youth, 0 acres. Men also accessed more land, 6 acres, than women, 4 acres, and youth, 4 acres. Farm and bean farming characteristics. Beans were mainly grown for income, 76%, while only 24% were grown for food. It is important to note that beans are now more commercialized, and this might have implications for women in relation to income from sale of beans. Bean production constraints. Pests and diseases was a common production constraint affecting majority of the respondents, especially the youth, 65%. More women, 5%, than men, 3%, and youth, 2%, were affected by lack of access to fertilizer. This result indicates that vulnerability to adverse effects of climate change varies by gender, possibly due to disparities in resource endowment, awareness, knowledge, and access to agricultural support services. Post-harvest constraints. More women, 21%, mentioned excessive rains during harvesting to be a major post-harvest constraint. Lack of knowledge on post-harvest handling was mentioned by more women, 4%, than men, 3%, and the youth, 2%. By contrast, more men, 3%, and youth, 3%, mentioned storage pests as a post-harvest constraint. Marketing constraints. More women, 10%, reported that distance to market was a marketing constraint. Additionally, more women, 4%, than men, 3%, and youth, 2%, mentioned poor means of transport as a constraint. By contrast, more men, 42%, and youth, 33%, mentioned price fluctuations as a marketing constraint. Changes made in response to production constraints by gender. Majority of the women, 53%, used pesticides. Majority of the youth, 25%, used fertilizer, while majority of the men, 18%, preferred improved varieties. Timely planting was preferred equally by men and women, 7%, than by the youth, 6%. Decision maker about changes to protect bean production against production constraints by gender. More men farmers, 79%, than women, 74%, and youth, 73%, said that both men and women in the household made the decision to make changes in response to the production constraints. Use of climate-smart agricultural technologies and practices by gender. Conservation agriculture, 62%, and pesticide use, 40%, were the most frequently used climate-smart agricultural practices, followed by the use of fertilizer, 30%, and improved seed, 24%. Farmers' access to institutional, technical, and social support services. Access to production information and agricultural training was low, with only 28% and 26% of the respondents reporting that they received the support respectively. Women had marginally lower access to information via social media and mobile phones than men and youth. Low access to information via mobile phones was reported, despite 91% of the respondents indicating that they owned mobile phones. Determinants of use of climate-smart technologies and practices. Younger farmers were more likely to use improved bean seed and fertilizer than women farmers. Education had a significant positive influence on the use of improved seeds, fertilizer, pesticides, and conservation agriculture. Married farmers were less likely to use improved seed, fertilizer, and conservation agriculture. Conclusion: Gender and intersectional categories influence adaptation to changing climate conditions. There were gender differences in ownership and access to land, with men owning and having higher access to land than women and youths. Joint decision-making dominated bean farming decisions. There were also gender disparities in bean production constraints, with women and young farmers being more vulnerable than men. There was also low institutional, technical and social support to enable farmers to adopt climate-smart technologies and practices. There were systematic differences in terms of factors that condition the use of agricultural technologies and practices. Addressing gender disparities in land access to digital technology, encouraging women's literacy through higher education and collective action are likely to enhance the resilience dimension in farming. We acknowledge financial and technical support from PABRA, TARI, the Alliance, SDC and GAC. Lastly, thank you for listening.